DogWorks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by First Paw Coffee Company, specializing in private label premium blend coffee. If you're serious about coffee, you should check it out. First Paw Coffee's passion is high-quality, small-batch roasted coffee. They take the extra time to taste and get everything perfect before they release new blends. They aim to bring you a cup of happiness each time you pour yourself some coffee. Find out more at ak.dog/free and enter for a chance to win some First Paw Coffee prizes, a book from our collection, and tote bag. One winner will be selected at random each month. That's ak.dog/free.
From First Paw Media, sponsored by Alaska Dog Works Professional Canine Training Center in Anchorage, Alaska. This is DogWorks Radio, committed to families and their dogs to build lifelong and fulfilling relationships. Visit our website at dogworksradio.com. Now here are your hosts, Robert and Michelle Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to DogWorks Radio on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site, and you can find all of our episodes over on dogworksradio.com. You can also find us on social media by searching DogWorks Radio. And today we're going to be talking to author Clive Wynne about his brand new book, Dog is Love. This is a fascinating topic. I'm so happy to jump into this. He's calling in from Tempe, Arizona. Clive, how's it going today?
Robert, very good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Before we jump into your book, Clive, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're all about, please?
Sure, yeah. So right now I am a professor at Arizona State University, where I'm the founding director of the Canine Science Collaboratory. I came here from the University of Florida, and before that I had a decade of my life in Australia, and originally I was born in the south of England.
And, of course, you're also a very well-written author now with the brand new book, and I'm looking forward to that. But your job fascinates me. I've been involved with dog behavior since the early 90s, and this is really right up my wheelhouse, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I was reading through some of the information online, and it says that you have done some work at a wolf park in Indiana. Is that right?
That's right, Robert. So I talk about this quite a bit in the book Dog is Love because it's been very important in deepening my understanding of what makes dogs special. That about more than a decade, I think, ago now, I was invited out to Wolf Park in Indiana, where they've been hand-rearing wolves since 1974. So they have wolves that are about as friendly and so on as you could really expect to find anywhere in the world. And so my students and I carried out a series of tests on these wolves, coming to, as I say, a deeper grasp of really what makes dogs so different from wolves that they're very closely related to, and yet their behavior is really very different.
And that's actually my next question. And, a lot of people compare wolves to dogs on many levels. They say, oh, he's just a dog in wolf's clothing, or he has the traits of the wolf, or he's the alpha dog or the beta dog or whatever. And I think a lot of understanding comes from that and, sort of that wolf behavior to dog, but they are entirely different species, aren't they? And can you tell us a little bit of the main differences between the two?
Well, sure, Robert. I mean, the amazing thing is that wolves and dogs are genetically very closely related, right? I mean, all of our dogs are descended from wolves, and it really wasn't that long ago. It was maybe 15 to 20,000 years ago, which sounds like a long time, but actually for evolution to do any work, 15 to 20,000 years is just a blink of an evolutionary eye. So there's very strong genetic relatedness. But in those 15,000 years, dogs set off on a journey that has made them quite different beings from wolves in the way that they act. So, biologists over the decades have studied these things quite a bit. And so it's quite clear now that dogs and wolves have completely different family structures. Wolves actually, what we call a wolf pack is actually just a nuclear family. Wolves pair pretty much for life, and the mother and the father take care to raise their young over the first couple of years of life. Whereas in dogs, dog fathers left to their own devices do just that absolute minimum that is necessary to qualify as fatherhood. And then even the mothers are not particularly engaged with their young. Mothers usually nurse for 8 or so weeks of life, but then if they're left again to their own devices, mothers kick their pups out at about 8 weeks of life. So you don't get the same kind of family structure in dogs that you find in wolves. That said, and perhaps it seems slightly contradictory, in studies that we've done, we've found that dogs more readily form connections to people than even the best reared, hand-reared wolves. And so this is a large part of what I talk about in the book Dog is Love, that wolves form relationships, of course they do, but they tend to form small numbers of lifelong bonds. Whereas dogs are much more ready to make new friends. Most dogs go through life forever engaging in an affectionate way with new people and new members of other species that they meet as they go through life. So you get an important difference in the behavior of dogs and wolves that we really need to pay more attention to, I think.
And one of the studies in the book, Clive, you talk about either a pointing or a following effect between wolves and dogs and how each one of them sort of took it on its own. And that's what fascinated me in terms of a dog training perspective, because obviously when we're working with dogs to change their behavior or to mold their behavior, one of the things that we're looking at is to make sure that they are paying attention to us and following our hand signals and that sort of thing. And that's something you studied. Is that right?
That's right, Robert. So that's a domain where actually I do not see big differences between wolves and dogs. I mean, it's perhaps not terribly important because there are not very many people trying to train wolves to do anything. But in terms of trainability, my feeling is that your wolf is just as successful as your dog. And the experiment you're describing, where a person points at something and we observe whether the animal goes where we point, that was originally proposed about 15 years ago. Some people suggested that was a major difference between dogs and all other living species. That dogs and only dogs could understand that if a person points at something, then they mean that there's something good for the animal to be found in the direction they're pointing at. And what we found, this is early in my time as a dog behavior researcher, what we found is that that's really not true. Well, I mean, of course, it's true that dogs do that. Anybody who has a dog knows that their dog goes where they point. But it's not true that that is something unique to dogs. If you have a well hand-reared wolf, the wolf will do the same thing. People have shown it now with goats, with dolphins. We even did a study with bats, which I think sheds very important light on how it comes about that an animal has a tendency to look where somebody is pointing. And we had access to a community of bats. About half of these bats had been born at the sanctuary where we were doing our testing and been raised by their mothers, by their batty mothers. But the other half of the bats that we tested had originally been people's pets. Now, bats don't make good pets, and so sooner or later, most people who think they want a bat for a pet end up giving it up. And so this sanctuary had quite a lot of bats that had started life as pets. And what we found was that the bats that had started life as pets, they would follow human pointing gestures, whereas the bats that had been raised by their mothers would not follow human pointing gestures. And so what this shows to me, and what we concluded from this and from other studies on other species, is that the sensitivity that an animal shows to what people are going about doing, what people are up to, that sensitivity depends on that animal's early life. And if you are reared as a pet in a human home, then even if you are a member of a wild species, like a bat, you will turn out to be sensitive to what people are doing. And on the other hand, if you are reared by the parents of your own species, your natural parents, and you live with them all your life, then you're not going to pay attention to what people are doing, which I think makes perfectly good sense. I mean, animals that live with people are very dependent on people, and so they spend a lot of time paying attention to what people are doing. And on the other hand, animals, even if they're dogs, from a domesticated species, if they're reared well away from people, well, then they don't pay attention to what people are doing. Why should they?
That is absolutely fascinating. That happens to lead into my next question, and you had brought it up a little bit earlier about sort of the rearing aspects of dogs, with them only being with their mothers for such a limited time, and sort of that rule of thumb when puppies are available for sale or for adoption is typically about 8, 10, or 12 weeks, and most likely that's typically enough time on both sides, either learning from their sort of family structure in that part, and then being able to accept, the human part of it as well. But you talk about if dogs are away from people for an extended period of time, and I'm thinking about like mongrel dogs or street dogs or something like that, and, they've been on their own devices their entire life. What happens when they are brought into a human family nucleus? And you see this all the time about, especially on social media and on Facebook and things, and they say, Max, the street dog, has been on his own for his entire life, and he's 6 years old, and now he's found love with his new family. What is your thought with that?
Well, Robert, there are certainly successful cases of people adopting street dogs and bringing them into their home. Those tend to be professional animal trainers who have a fairly deep understanding of dog behavior and view it as an interesting challenge to use their skills to help that dog adapt to a massive, massive change in life circumstances. But unfortunately, I'm not a dog trainer. I wouldn't have the time or expertise to do this. The vast majority of people just don't. And the change in life circumstance that we're asking this animal to go through, sure, obviously living on the streets is tough. Of course it's tough. And those dogs get sick and they don't get treated and they get run over by traffic. And overall, they have shorter life expectancies than dogs that live as pets in our homes. But on the other hand, it is a life, and it has pros as well as cons. Those dogs get to do whatever they want to do every moment of the day. They are never confined inside four walls. And to adjust to this new existence, maybe stuck in an apartment, maybe living with somebody who's out at work 8, 10, 12 hours of the day, that's a heck of a lot to ask an animal to cope with if that's not been their life experience. So I'm afraid for me, I think most of the time it's well-intentioned, but it's misplaced. And particularly when we think about what it sometimes costs. Depending exactly where these dogs are coming from, the cost of bringing them to our homes can be thousands of dollars. I was talking to a guy in Britain the other week who was telling me that now there are people importing dogs from Romania, which is in the far east of Europe and a relatively poor country. And I said to him, my feeling is if you have thousands of dollars or pounds or whatever available to you and you really want to be helping the dogs of Romania or any other impoverished part of the world, then you should be investing your money in that community and lifting the whole community, not snatching, what do we imagine, 1 in 1,000 of the dogs that live there, snatching a tiny fraction of the dogs out of that community and bringing them into your community. That may make you feel good, but it's not really doing anything for any significant number of the dogs. Never mind the people. Do we not care about the children who, like the dogs, also roam the streets with no health care and so on? I think we need a more holistic, a more community-centered approach to helping those dogs in their communities.
That's a great answer to that, and it was something right down the same line that I was thinking about. It's again awesome to want to go save dogs and to to be their companions or their family, but it is very difficult to sort of translate that over. One of the main quotes in your book, or what has been said in particular on reviews, it says, "The essence of dog is love." And of course, that's the title of your book. Can you explain that statement a little bit, and what are your thoughts on it?
Well, sure, of course, Robert. So I called the book Dog is Love because after much scrutiny, I've come to realize that what I felt as a kid and what a lot of people feel quite intuitively is actually true. And that is that our dogs really do love us. And I think that is the secret of their success in human society. So there have been scientists who've argued that dogs have special forms of intelligence, and I don't think that's true. I mean, I know there are smart dogs out there, but I don't really think dogs' intelligence is particularly exceptional compared to other species. What is truly remarkable is this unbounded desire to connect, to make emotional connections. And I explore how, there are people, my mother, for example, used to say that it's just cupboard love, and the dog just loves us because we feed her. And there are studies that have been done that show that this just is not true, that actually under certain circumstances, if they haven't had food for a while, but they also haven't had the company of their beloved person for a while, the dog will actually choose the person in preference to the food. So there are studies that show that dogs can prefer people that they love to food. And I explore in the book other studies that dig into the dog's biology, looking at hormones, looking at brain activity, and even going all the way down, Robert, to the deepest level of biological organization, to their genes, where I talk about research that my students and I have been involved in, where we actually find 3 genes that have been mutated in the journey from wolf to dog. And there are very, very rare cases of people who also have changes in those genes. And those people show an exaggerated, the scientists call it exaggerated gregariousness. They show an exaggerated desire, capacity to form friendships, to form strong relationships that are really rather like we see in our dogs. So we see shining through this signal at every level of analysis that what makes dogs so remarkable is this unbounded desire, capacity to form strong emotional connections. In other words, to love.
That is fascinating, especially on the genetic side. How did you find that out? What was the process in doing so? And is it maybe even breed specific? You always find, what I'm thinking about is everybody in the world has Labradors and German Shepherds and Golden Retrievers and Border Collies. So those are sort of the dogs of people. Is it something related to that in terms of genetics and just what we accept in terms of breed?
Well, we first made this discovery by comparing the behavior of wolves and dogs, hand-reared wolves at Wolf Park and pet dogs, on very simple tests where we just measured how much time the animal wanted to spend up close with a person. And then we sent a collaborator, Bridget von Holt, DNA samples, which you just get with a mouth swab. And she analyzed the genetics, the genes, and she identified these 3 genes that account for the difference, that are different between wolves and dogs, that account for the difference in the behavior between wolves and dogs. So at a certain level, the experiment was very simple, although the technology involved in the genetics is very expensive and very complex. Now, as for breeds, everybody asks this question, and right now we're still waiting for the answer. So we did do a comparison just looking at the AKC breed descriptions, the big AKC book of the dog, also online now, where they have like a page describing the typical behavior of each breed of dog. And that includes a few comments about whether the dog is friendly towards strangers or aloof and so on. And we looked at that and we looked at the genes, and there is a relationship there. But I personally am a little bit iffy about using the AKC book of the dog as a scientific instrument, because it's based on experts' opinions and experts' experience, but it's not based on any scientific test. So right now my collaborators are going through and testing hundreds of dogs from different breeds, testing the behavior and looking at the genes, so we can get a more robust picture of that. But as you can perhaps imagine, Robert, since there are over 200 breeds of dog, and since we need to do several dogs from each breed to make sure that, we're getting a good picture of what a breed is really like, this is going to take some time.
So earlier you learned about First Paw Coffee Company, and now I'm going to tell you about its Tail Wagger Blend. First Paw Coffee Company's Tail Wagger Blend is their first offering, and its name and label were crowdsourced from their Facebook fans. How cool is that? The Tail Wagger Blend is a private label premium blend that was developed just for them. It is a medium roast from Colombian beans with tastes of Brazil nuts, grapefruit, and oak. Be sure to go to ak.dog/free and enter to win a bunch of cool prizes. That's ak.dog/free.
So my next question, Clive, is sort of our human connection with dogs, in particular where people live and our experience with dogs. And I'm sure you being from across the pond and also doing your work here in the U.S., you see our differences between human-dog connections in different cultures. Where does that come into play, for folks that, have this understanding of dogs in the U.S. or in the Western world, compared to, third world countries and whatnot? How do they perceive this dog's love compared to how we do in kind of more of a dog society, I guess, if you will?
Yeah, right, Robert. Well, so it's certainly true that around the surface of the globe, people in different cultures have different attitudes towards dogs. There are cultures that consider dogs unclean, compared to most people here in the United States and in other first world countries who are very happy to have dogs come in even to their bedrooms, which is in many ways the most intimate part of our lives. And so that certainly differs, and quite reasonably so, I should add. I mean, in India, there are still tens of thousands of people die of rabies every year, which is a particularly horrible way to go, and dogs are the main vector for rabies in India. So it's not unreasonable that people in other countries are cautious around dogs. But what's interesting is, even in cultures where people are not terribly keen on the dogs, they do perceive that the dogs are keen on them. And I remember I visited some people in Nicaragua who found it sort of embarrassing. The men went hunting with dogs, and the men clearly found it sort of embarrassing that their dogs were so keen on them. But it was undeniable that the dogs were keen on the men, even if the men weren't sure what they thought of the dog's enthusiasm for them. So people all around the world can see that dogs are interested and care for them, even if they're not sure that they want to reciprocate it. And as I say, there can be understandable reasons why people are skeptical around dogs in other communities.
Clive, we have time for just a couple of more questions. And one of the things that we always do on our show, and we have a lot of authors and filmmakers and other creatives on, but I'd love to hear sort of the nuts and bolts behind the scenes part of making a book or making a film. What was the process for this? Did you go in with just a couple of questions that you intended to answer, sort of that scientific method? Or is this sort of a collection of work, of all of the work that you've done around dogs? And if so, what was the process of bringing everything together to come up with the book?
Well, so Robert, that's a great question. So for me, in this particular case, I had a sort of an aha moment several years ago when I began to think that actually it was affection that was the essence of dogs. And I started telling people about this because, there are a lot of people interested in dogs. And I get invited to give talks from time to time. And I could tell the audiences were really interested in this and hungry to learn more. And even talking for a couple of hours or a day, you don't really cover very much ground. And so I started collecting my notes and my thoughts and building them out. And, of course, I first thought about my own work, and to some degree thinking about this book actually shaped the direction of my research. But then I also started being more conscientious. I know, I'm supposed to, as a professor, I ought to be reading everybody's science all the time, but in practice, I don't always get to everything. So I started being more conscientious in reading what other people were doing and realizing that there was a tapestry here that could be drawn together and that certain themes came out really, really clearly. And so that's really the story of structuring and pulling the things together. And then once I had all my ducks in a row, the writing of it was not terribly difficult or especially time consuming, aside from, my other duties, of course, getting in the way all the time.
Interesting. Clive, a couple of minutes left. How can folks find out more about you and your book, please?
Absolutely, Robert. So I have a website, dogislovebook.com, and that tells people how to find the book, where to get the book, and a little bit about my background and the kinds of things I'm up to, speaking engagements, all that kind of good stuff.
Excellent. Thank you very much for being on the show today. Clive Wynne, he is a PhD and also author of the brand new book, Dog is Love. It was my pleasure having you on, and we look forward to talking again, okay?
Thank you, Robert. It was fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. On behalf of our guest today, this is Robert Forto. We will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by First Paw Coffee Company. Learn more at firstpaw.coffee.
From First Paw Media, this is DogWorks Radio. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Robert and Michelle Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto and created for First Paw Media. Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.